Good morning, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Before we get going on the session, there's one reminder that concurrent sessions are first come, first served seating, so we have room here, but note for this session and for other sessions that there's no standing room, so you need to get to where you want to go plenty early, which you all did, so thank you. We'll start with some introductions. My name is Emma Louden. I am a PhD student in astrophysics at Yale right now. I also do some strategy work looking at the future of space exploration and what astrophysics is going to look like in the coming couple of decades. And I'm joined by two amazing panelists here to talk about the future of women in space and pioneering health and science beyond Earth. I'll let them introduce themselves and then we'll kick off this panel.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here from the United States. Canada is fun and always very polite and welcoming. So thank you for that. It's been a great conference. My name is Dr. Tara Ruttley. I had spent about 21 years at NASA. The first 8 years, I was in charge of, I was an engineer, actually, in charge of the health and medical equipment on the International Space Station. And for about 12 years after that, I was what was called Associate Chief Scientist for the International Space Station. And that means I got to help manage all the experiments that were happening on the space station. And if you don't know what the space station is, it's probably because it's so normal to you now, because looking at your ages, it's been up there probably as long as you've been alive now. So the first piece went up in 1998, and then the first humans went up in 2000. I joined NASA in 2001, so my entire career has been about this amazing laboratory that is about 250 miles, part of my metrics, above our heads. It's not that far up. It's going around the Earth once every 90 minutes, and there are about, usually at any time, 6 people on orbit, and they rotate in and out, and they'll stay for about 6 months to a year, and the whole purpose is to do research in low Earth orbit, or microgravity. That's when things float. That's when things are free-falling, and when you do that, you can have a really great, amazing new discovery period. You can create new things, you can find new things you haven't seen before in experiments if you're a scientist, because on Earth you can change all the variables in your lab, except for 9.81 meters per second squared. So that's the big one, and that's why we are in space. And so I did that for the first 21 years of my career, and then a couple years ago I left NASA, my dream job, to join a small private space company called Blue Origin. And there we are now working. I am chief scientist of something called Orbital Reef, which is a commercial space station we're building to replace the International Space Station when it is set to retire in the year 2030, so that we can keep doing good research on all the disciplines, including human health, that we'll talk about today. And it's really just great to be here, so we'll talk about all that.
Awesome, thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, so I'm really happy to be here and excited to be part of this panel. So my name is Faye. I'm a medical researcher working at the Mayo Clinic in Florida in the US. I've been in my role for over a year, and I'm really happy there. I'm in a stem cell and regenerative medicine group, but before that I was in Sydney, Australia, where I was working in a cardiovascular lab looking at the effect of diabetes on blood clots in patients with different blood disorders. Before that I was in New Zealand. That's where I'm from and where I did my studies. So I did my biomedical science degree there and my honors degree, looking at the visual system, looking at field of ophthalmology, looking at cataract disease. I also did several different research internships looking at computational modeling of the lung and the pulmonary system. So I've kind of explored different areas of the medical sciences. I'm very happy with the stem cell and regenerative medicine field that I'm in right now. I think it's a very exciting field, and of course I'm in a space medicine group too. So our lab in Florida, we're connected to the Kennedy Space Center. We're sponsored and funded by NASA. We have collaborators in Colorado, and we've been doing space research since 2017. And some really cool, exciting things in our lab is we have a passion towards trying to advance stem cell therapies in space so that we can use them in patients on Earth. So we want to translate this knowledge and translate the applications that we could do in space and actually use them to benefit mankind on Earth. And that is a passion that I have on a personal level, is trying to use space as this tool. You know, space is so close to us. Every nation shares a border with space. And so being able to use that environment to advance medical knowledge, to advance scientific practice, and to create therapies, develop drugs for patients, I think is a really unique thing. And that's something I want to become a part of.
You're already a part of and making strides in it. Let's go ahead and start with some questions to kind of think about why we're even talking about people in space. So I'm going to start with a question for you. Why do we send humans to space in the first place when robots are really good? Like, we have only robots on Mars and we've learned so much. What do we gain by sending humans to space?
Well, first of all, the anthropologist in me will say, robots will never have the kind of judgment, the kind of storytelling capabilities, the kind of experiences that humans have. And so that's why we will continue to send humans to space. And if you say robots to an astronaut, they're kind of like, okay, as helpers, yes, but they'll never be able to get that human experience to take back and share with the world and keep inspiring. But the reason we go to space in the first place, and we've been sending people into space for decades now, is because, well, first of all, we started because we wanted to explore. It's one of these things that we just wanted to do. And actually, initially, it was a race between the United States and Russia. So there's that. Russia was the first one to put someone into space. America caught up. But we have since sent over 650 people into space. And it has evolved from just, let's explore and see what happens, to mostly using that unique environment for science and creating new products. And so when you take that gravity vector away, which, by the way, there are no anti-gravity chambers here on Earth. That doesn't exist. That's in the movies. There are airplanes that can give you a little bit of microgravity in about 30 seconds, but nothing sustained. So for the big experiments, you want to do that in low Earth orbit. And so when you think about things like how the water or the coffee in your cup is just sitting at the very bottom, it's behaving in a way that you can predict. But in space, that wouldn't exactly work, and that wouldn't exactly happen. The water would start crawling up the walls and hiding in the corners and cracks and crevices, and that will get you thinking about things that you hadn't thought about before as a scientist, things that aren't so intuitive. So we send science to space so that we can learn new things that we haven't learned in textbooks. And those scientists become explorers and discoverers. So that's basic in lab talk. But we also have these human beings that are in space, and we want to continue to send them onto the moon, and we want to send them to Mars and stay longer and longer. For the space station, the longest person's just over a year. We don't know what happens to the body beyond a year, and a mission to Mars is 9 months there, you're on the surface, for a year, you're back 9 months. It's like a 3-year round trip. So what we know about the human body, and we've learned over the decades, is that it is also designed for 9.81 meters per second squared. It's a happy place on Earth. And when you send it up into something else, your body is really good at adapting. It's really good at getting rid of systems that you don't need to use anymore. So for example, you don't need to walk around. Your bone and the muscle, you don't need those anymore. You're not climbing stairs, you're not working against gravity. So if you don't use it in space, those things will start to deteriorate. Your bones and muscle loss. Your heart won't need to pump as hard. You won't need as much fluid in your body because you don't need to move it around from the bottom of your feet. So you start to change, and then now the bone loss could lead to kidney stones as you're processing that through this lower fluid. Even the inner ear, the vestibular system, knows that the gravity is not down anymore, and so your balance system changes, your vestibular system changes. Just about any system in the body you can think about will change in the microgravity environment. Now we take that information and we say that's important for our astronaut health, but it's also important as we use it to model certain diseases that we see, or aging situations that we see here on Earth. Osteoporosis, immune changes, health in terms of cardiovascular diseases and changes. We can take that information because astronauts do it much more quickly than the populations on Earth. So because of that, we can keep doing that kind of research on human health in space, because it helps not just space exploration, but those of us here on Earth as well.
Awesome. We convinced me we need to send more humans to space.
Anybody who wants to go to space?
There you go.
Yeah, okay, this is out of this room full of people, only 3 raised their hands, 4? All right, I got you.
So we know that we want to send humans to space. We know there's value in that. Can you talk a little bit about what is the value of doing research in space? Because when I think of Mayo Clinic, I don't know that many people would think of, space research. Can you talk a little bit more about what your lab is doing and maybe the samples that you just got back?
Yeah, of course. So I'll answer that question in 2 parts. So the first one is, why do we send people into space, or what is the whole point of conducting medical research or scientific research in space, or studying human beings in space? So first is, we need to study astronauts that go into space. When people go onto the ISS, the International Space Station, whether it's for a few weeks or 6 months or a year, we need to know what happens to them when they're there. What happens to them when they come back? Do any of their systems that change in microgravity in space go back to baseline when they're on the Earth. We've seen that in certain systems like our cognitive abilities, some of our heart problems, they don't go back to baseline, and astronauts suffer for months on end when they return. So what happens when we go into deep space? As Tara mentioned, like when we have a 3-year journey to Mars, what happens when we exit the Earth's protective magnetosphere, when we're no longer protected, and we are faced with space radiation, ionizing radiation, galactic cosmic rays? We're going to have an increase in incidence of cancers, of mutations, of all sorts of things. And again, as Tara mentioned, we have evolved on this Earth for millions of years with this vital force called gravity, and in space, that is removed. We have a microgravity environment, so everything changes, and everything has to either adapt or it has to suffer and deteriorate. So when we're sending people into space, and we're going to continue sending people into space, not only through NASA and space agencies, but through private companies, we need to know what is going to happen to our health and how can we deal with the changes that are going to happen. And another thing is we're going to have space tourism. We're going to have regular people like you and I who are not in peak physical health, who are not astronauts, who have not been screened medically, who can go into space. We're seeing billionaires paying tons of money going into space. So that's important. We need to know what's going to happen to people who might have asthma, who might have diabetes, who might have sort of mental health problems, who can't deal with stress like astronauts can deal with it. So that's number one, why we need to study human health in space, and we need to look at every organ system because it's affected. And the cool thing is NASA has kind of categorized different organ systems in terms of their risk. Like our visual system, our cardiovascular system, that is high risk because a lot changes in microgravity. Our musculoskeletal system is at high risk because it doesn't go back to the way it used to be, and that 1% of bone mineral density you lose every month on the ISS, you don't get that back. And we have some medium risk systems like the pulmonary system, which is something I've studied in microgravity, where it is so resilient. You'd be surprised that the lungs are so sensitive, but they are so resilient to changes in microgravity despite the pressure and volume changes. And then you have some of your lower risk organs or lower risk systems. So having this sort of category of systems also allows us to know what do we need to focus on and what is less of a priority, because of course I think it's going to be very difficult to try and target the whole body when we send people into space. The second reason we should be studying people in space, we should be conducting medical research in space where institutes like the Mayo Clinic are contributing, is simply for scientific novelty and discovery. Human beings have always been curious ever since ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, the Egyptians, thousands of years ago. People looked up at the sky and they wondered. And then when technology advanced, we created telescopes, and then technology advanced even more as we created rockets and we sent people up. So we've always been curious. So as medical scientists, as physicians, clinicians, we're also curious what happens to the biology of cells, what happens to the mechanisms of cells, signaling molecules, pathways, cancer, how does cancer react in microgravity? We've seen that cancer in microgravity, it's shocked. It's in this environment where it doesn't grow. We've seen that some cancers actually are reduced in microgravity. So what if we can use this as a therapy? So this brings me to my third point. Not only does the space environment allow us to know more about biology, because on the Earth we have gravity, there's a lot we don't see when we put cells and tissues in microgravity, we put mouse models into microgravity, we see things we would have otherwise not been able to see on the Earth. So, second point is trying to advance scientific knowledge and novelty. And the third point, which I think is really important, and again, the Mayo Clinic is involved in this, is trying to use this knowledge to better humans. Not only the travelers, the 1 or 2% that might go into space, but what about regular people on Earth? What about people who need stem cell-based therapies, patients with stroke, osteoporosis? What if we can develop products in space? What if we can biomanufacture products better, more efficiently in space? And we've seen already that some cells, some tissues, they have a benefit to growing in space. They have a benefit to being in the space environment. So that's something that I'm really excited about in the future, is using space for Earth. A lot of people ask, what's the point of space? Why is it so important? Why do we invest so much money? And why is an institute like the Mayo Clinic, which is a hospital, getting involved in this? It's because there can be true translation, and we can see this in the next 10, 12 years, where we can see things being manufactured in space for patients on Earth.
Yeah, and if I may, I will say, people do say, why are we going to space anyway? Why are we spending all that money? And at least in the United States, NASA's budget is 0.5% of the entire United States budget. We do a whole lot for very little, and that's pretty much the way it is around the world with the other space agencies too, mostly because people are passionate, want to be there, and they'll get it done.
Yeah, I did a project once where I did a rough estimate of how many times do you interact with technology or anything in your daily life that was indirectly or directly created through space research. And it's upwards of 20 things per day that the average person is going to touch. And if you're in a high technology environment, it's much higher. So space impacts all of our lives every day. And that's one of the most amazing things that we can see in the health world, as evidenced by this conversation already. I want to talk a little bit about orbital reef specifically, because we've been switching from this era of space is all done by government. It's done, like ISS is run by an amazing coalition of international governments. But now there are, I think, 3 different commercial space stations that are under development, and will be competing to basically take over some of the work that the ISS has been doing when the ISS is deorbited. So can you talk a little bit about what that will mean for humans in space as we switch from government astronaut selection, which is extremely rigorous and super detailed, to something where people can, a different model for getting up there that doesn't necessarily involve such physical exams?
Yeah, very good question. So this is the future. For those of you who raised your hand, you might get the opportunity, and the goal is that we're building these commercial space stations, and Orbital Reef is what ours is called at Blue Origin. We're building this space station for you. You can bring your science up, you can go as a tourist, and what we're trying to do is make it more cost effective by reusing our rockets and making them more efficient and larger, and that has been the challenge in the past in getting more and more people into space. But now that we're sending, those of you who raised your hands, you have a different medical profiles between each of you. And if you're a woman, you have an especially different medical profile between each of you. So we have the biggest challenge. This is something I'm experiencing now in private industry that I did not experience when I worked at NASA, because we knew the government astronauts' health very, very well, even though even the small amount of women who are in the astronaut corps. We knew the health, right? Now it could be anything. And so personalized medicine is important. Understanding human behavior is important. Responses to the body in women that we don't even understand on Earth, we're gonna have to tackle that for spaceflight too. And it's gonna come faster. We are gonna send women and men into space privately faster than the research is gonna happen. So what's happening now with Blue Origin is we have a rocket called New Shepard, and we launch out of West Texas. It's an 11-minute round trip to space and back. You get about 3 minutes of microgravity and floating around, and you can, as a regular citizen, pay to do this. And so each one of those space private astronauts, it is a data point for us. We are using this as a way to better understand how their behavior is in space, and how they react, and if they want to go back, and do they spread the word. And we haven't started on their medical and their health capabilities yet. Right now, it's mostly up to them and the discussions between them and their doctors. But what we are is we're taking those next steps to start gathering that data. And NASA also wants the private industry to gather that data. So I will say, NASA has sent, everybody, about 650 people total have gone to space. Of those 650, about 76 of them have been women. So that's only like 11%. So we don't have a lot of data on the human body of a woman in space. We do have some, but even among men and women, spaceflight data is very individualized. How your body is going to react is very highly individualized as it is. Put the woman in that and our complex systems, a little bit different than the men and all that we've sent to space. It's a whole different challenge, and one that is layered in regulations and layered in medicine and layered in things that we haven't even thought about right now, that we haven't even thought about yet, but we're gonna have to. And so we've got a lot of work to do here at Blue Origin with Orbital Reef and getting that ready for you all.
It's an exciting time to be thinking about going to space, because it is much more, the bar to entry is still quite high price-wise, but it's a much more democratized process. And it's really, that's one of the things I love about the space industry right now, is that we've seen this shift from it being a really small group of people to a really vibrant industry around the world. And that industry also creates spin-offs that are then part of our lives every day. I want to pull on 2 things that you said there. First, one of the most amazing parts of what's happening right now with the new classes of astronauts that are going to be private astronauts is that we can start to right some of the wrongs of history and make sure that we're then ready to have a future in space that is really equitable and intersectional and doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past. Last week, Ed Dwight went to space. He's now the oldest person to have gone to space. I believe he's 92, is that right? Yeah, 92. He was in NASA's astronaut pool in the 1960s, but was African American and was not chosen for many political reasons at the time in Congress. And it was so amazing to go watch his flight last week and see him go to space. But then you also get the added element of what does it look like for a 92-year-old to go to space, and how do companies start to prepare for that? And it adds to what you were saying about how we need to be ready to learn more data. Can you talk a little bit about the data on women's health and Mayo Clinic's role trying to understand women's health, and then also thinking about how that relates to space, and what projects maybe are happening there?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Mayo Clinic as an institute overall, they've been really involved in the Women's Health Network that's a part of their institute, and they're very involved in personalized medicine for women. If you were to go see a physician or go see a healthcare practitioner at the Mayo Clinic, if you're a woman, things are looked at differently, but that's how it should be, because we know there are sex differences, there are discrepancies in men and women's health. So it's this more personalized approach to health. And of course, as we get into like space medicine research, we have to look at the sex differences that occur in biology in space. Right now with our stem cell research, it's sex independent. We're looking at just bone marrow derived stem cells and studying them. But of course, as we advance further in our research, and especially if we start putting these stem cells into mouse models, we'll have to look at the effects of putting it in a female mouse. What about a male mouse? We also have to look at, if we were to do clinical trials, we have to have an equal number of female and males. And that's something we've seen historically in medical research, earth-based medical research, is there is a discrepancy where majority of participants are male. And I saw this in my own research, doing a comprehensive review about pulmonary health in space, where 25% of the studies I looked at didn't even include female participants. And those that did include participants, female participants, they only had 30% women in those studies. So that just shows what a gap there is in that kind of research. And that's something we really need to fill. And yeah, the Mayo Clinic is definitely involved in trying to make that, because women's health is a part of their mission, it's a part of their ideologies as a hospital, and that's something we'll incorporate into our research once we get into those details, and once we can confirm that these stem cells are viable to use and we want to use them for therapy, then yes, of course, we have to look at those differences.
Yeah, that's very important. So we have this set up now where we have health research happening in space. It's not only happening in government labs, it's also happening in private labs, or will be soon, hopefully. Let's talk about who is doing this. Like, what are the companies, who are the labs? We know the Mayo Clinic is interested in this, but who are gonna be the customers for something like Orbital Reef? What kinds of industries are interested in doing this?
Yeah, so right now, the biggest effort that's being led, at least in the United States, is through a group called TRISH, which I think stands for Translational Research in Space Health. And they are funded by NASA and in conjunction with, I think, Baylor University. And they're kind of like the skunk works, or the cutting edge lab that NASA's Human Research Program kind of can use to do the work that NASA itself can't do. And so they're doing the advanced work. So they are constantly talking to us. They're talking to other commercial space providers who are also sending these rockets into space for either a long time going to space station, these private astronauts, or these suborbital flights like ours. So they're talking to all of us, and they're trying to coordinate with us and our private astronaut community about, hey, let's get a centralized database now that can be trusted and shared and regulated, so now that we are starting to collect this data on the average everyday person that we're sending into space, because I think I've lost the number, the count on how many private astronauts that have actually gone to space. It must be somewhere pushing 50, if not over that. And either they're there for only 3 minutes, or they're there on the space station for up to 10 days. And as a scientist, which is what I am, I'm like, that's data lost that on every single person, and it's such good rare data. So I think that company, that private corporate organization, TRISH, is doing the best they can to consolidate the community, encourage collaboration, and then, so that's at the human level. And then organizations like FAY, we at the Space Station Program and at Orbital Reef are counting on them to do the research that's cutting edge in the labs, not at the human level, but at the cellular level, because we can't do that in humans. So we need to understand what's also going on in ways that we can't measure privately. And so phase experiments that have gone on the space station and that are just, I guess, recently came back are like very, very critical to the advancement of what we're all trying to do here for all of you in the room.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that, is we're also seeing, space, as you said, is going from like a more government-funded thing to being privatized. We're also having more data, we're having more labs. And something I'm finding really interesting, because I'm from New Zealand and I've lived in other countries other than the US, which is a major space player, is we're having all these emerging space nations too, right? Where we're having space being a global effort. We're having all sorts of nations join the space race. We're having all this innovation coming from different places. And I think that's really important as we go further into space. It's no longer controlled by just a few countries and a few governments, but it's something that's open. It's open to private industry. It's open to hospitals, labs, scientists, people in the art world. It's open to other countries, smaller countries. And I think every country can do something that it's very good at and excel at it that can contribute to the global space economy. So yeah, I think that's really exciting as we're seeing this emergence of other nations joining space and other labs and other collaborators. Like growing up in New Zealand, I really did not think it was going to be possible for me to get into space medicine, at least this early in my career. And I always knew I'd have to go to the US at some point. But even when I was in Australia, when I was in New Zealand, I was a part of all these space medicine groups, even though space medicine is a niche within space, but it's growing. And yeah, it was really exciting just seeing that space is becoming a really important thing across all different countries, and space medicine and space health is also something that countries like New Zealand in the middle of the Pacific Ocean are studying, and they're starting to have labs, and they're starting to have engineers create rockets, and they're starting to have simulated microgravity experiments, which something 10 years ago was not a thing. Like in New Zealand, the space agency was only founded in 2017. But yeah, that's really exciting. I think that all countries are getting involved, and we can all be a part of it.
And I think that there's a really strong theme within the space community that it's really for the world, and not just for one country or even one company, but that it's really, we can say all these, there's a speech that I love that was given early 2000s by the NASA administrator where he talks about the real reasons we go to space and the acceptable reasons, and how all the acceptable reasons can be put into a spreadsheet. They can be all the numbers you give to governments, but the real reasons are much more about human curiosity and wonder and a drive to make the world better through this exploration. So as we talk about translation between countries and also translation of technology from one field to another, one thing that we'd be remiss to not bring up in Canada is the Canadarm, and the Canadarm's research on the ISS, and also what that can actually do in terms of relation for health. So teeing that up, I'm gonna let you talk about what you did yesterday.
NASA, we love the Canadian Space Agency. We are great partners with the CSA, and they have some allocation to be able to participate in the International Space Station. They're one of our partners. One of the major contributors the CSA has given to the program for Space Station, and they did for Shuttle as well, is the external arm, this external robotic arm that has this really great control, and it's used to move things externally, big things, small things. It's just this arm, and Canada's known for it, and it's produced by a company called MDA, and they've done it for decades. And so one of the really cool things that's come from this Canada arm on the space station is the translation of taking the haptics and the ability to create such a complicated robot in an environment of space where there's atomic oxygen, ultraviolet radiation, thermal swings, a vacuum. This company, in conjunction with CSA, was able to translate that to scientists and clinicians at the University of Calgary, right down the road, and create a robot that can be controlled by a brain surgeon in a room next door, and can do brain surgery on a person's within an MRI environment. And when I was at NASA, this was one of our favorite things to talk about. This is one of our favorite benefits because we actually have, we would show the picture of the first recipient of this kind of surgery. Her name was Paige Nickerson, and she was the first one to get that robotic surgery inside of an MRI environment where you can really visualize the tumor very well. And the surgeon was just down the hall, working telerobotically. And we talked about it forever, and we got to know the scientists, and just by coming to this conference, by the way, they were now this group, it's called NeuroArm at the University of Calgary. The device is called NeuroArm, and now it's evolved over the last decade to do very much more complicated and complex things, and giving so much good information to the surgeons as well, who are they're taking measurements in the brain that have never been able to be measured before in these patients. And it was also partly funded by Alberta Innovates. So it's like, to me, and they saw my name on this conference and invited me to a tour. To me, that was very surreal because I'd never been here. I'd never seen the NeuroArm. And to see firsthand the benefits that have come from space, a robot in space, to now changing decades of lives since then, and growing, and the lab has grown, and it's all because of investment from the province and investment from the government. To me, my mind was blown. So I just had to do a shout out for the NeuroArm community here, because this was full circle for me, and it is a really shining star of Alberta.
It's a really cool example of how there's the direct benefits where we do health research in space on astronauts or on cells, but then there's also the spin-off benefits that we can't necessarily predict, things like the arm. My personal favorite example is the algorithm that was used to dock the space shuttle on the International Space Station is the same algorithm that guides the laser for LASIK eye surgery. Like, who would have thought of that at the beginning? But these spin-offs really impact our everyday lives. So let's talk a little bit more about women's health in space. We know so little about the female body here on Earth. You have to do shockingly little research to figure out how much we don't know. I recently read an article about how car crash dummies, for example, were based upon the average male body. So women are much more likely to get injured in crashes because the car crash tests are done in such a way that it's not optimized for safety for multiple different body types. So can you talk about some other examples of things that are maybe in the past or things that we're working toward in the future in space women's health to try and make sure that we don't have those missteps or the lack of information, the lack of data that could result in real harm down the road?
Yeah, so I'll be brief and then I'll pass it to Faye, but talk about lack of data. When Sally Ride was America's first woman astronaut, and you might have heard this because it's made its rounds in the headlines, but she was asked in 1984 when she was prepping for her flight, is 100 tampons enough?
For 2 days.
For a week. Is 100 tampons enough for a week? And her response was, that's more than enough. That's too much. And so she was it, right? And so she, then, like I said, since then we've had maybe, 75 women fly in space, and that's over the last, 20, 30, 40 years now. I can't count back to the 80s already. But still, there's so few people that fly in space and so few women that fly in space that the subject counts preclude women-only studies. We have not done women-only studies in space because, again, it's so highly variable. We don't send enough people in the first place. And so there has not been, to my knowledge, unless something that's recently come out that I'm not familiar with, any experiment designed solely to look at women's health in space. And so what we can do is pull the data out by subject that we know, but nothing's designed for women in space yet. We'll get there, I would predict. But but you got to start with the conversation, which is what we're trying to do now. And I will say, things like spacesuits that fit women better, or toilets that fit women better, or just seats that fit women better. All of these things are actually being considered now as we evolve into going back to the moon. We get a chance to understand what works and then modify based on at least now what we know about women in space so far. Okay?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, as you mentioned with the data is so little. You mentioned 650 have been into space, 11% being women, less than 1% being Black women. So we really don't have that much data. And as a scientist, especially when you work on medical experiments or you conduct studies or want to design experiments, we need a specific number. You need like 30 participants, you need 100, you need 150 for the data to be worth looking into. But if we've had like 10 or 15 women, we've had 225 spacewalks conducted in space, only 15 were conducted by women. So we don't have the data to really know what happens to women in space. But when we've sent mouse models into space, we've seen that the space environment, it affects ovulation of these mice, it affects miscarriages in these mice. So so we need to know down the line what's going to happen to women as more women go into space. And I think the only real solution is sending more women into space. Sending more women into space. When you design experiments, instead of having 7 male participants and 3 female participants, how about we do 50-50? Or design all women experiments. Send 10 women into space and study those 10 women. And we've seen, as I mentioned previously with that one study that I performed, that some studies have no female participants at all, and that needs to change. In our designing of experiments, in our designing of missions, we need to engineer specific solutions for women, as you mentioned, like chairs, toilets, hardware, the gloves, anything. We know that men and women are different physically, physiologically, and we need to account for those differences so it can be more comfortable for women, and so we can be involved in space and be appreciated in space and be appreciated in the engineering that's going behind it. So I think, yeah, the solution is sending more women into space. If we're doing the spaceflight research studies, we need more participants, whether they're controls, whether we're sending them up there. We need to have more women-specific or women-oriented solutions. And of course, we need a more diverse pool of women as well.
I would say there was an article that came out several years ago, actually, that that's able to quantify going back and looking at women versus men in space. And so there is a publication out there that looks at the differences. And they did find some differences, such as women are more prone to kidney stones in space because we're more prone to bone loss, which is a thing here on Earth as well. Where women are more prone to something called orthostatic intolerance. If you've ever been underhydrated and go to stand up from your seat really quickly, you feel like you might black out or you get dizzy. That's called orthostatic intolerance. That's because the fluid is low, and so when the women come back from spaceflight with lower fluid, they have a harder time regulating syncope, but they're doing better. We're coming up with countermeasures on that. But for whatever reason, the cardiovascular system in the women isn't as responsive. The women, however, seem to have a lower incident of vision loss in space that's caused by space flight. So that's a good thing, and we think that might have something, again, to do with the way their cardiovascular system might regulate blood flow to the head or fluid flow to the head that pushes pressure on the eyes. And it seems like in tasks that require, when they're on orbit, women and men are compared in terms of tasks of speed versus accuracy. Women tend to prefer accuracy over speed, and so that's an interesting finding as well. But so there are some things that have been looked at, and you go back and you look and you quantify, but nothing, like Faye said, designed for solely for all women.
Which is a huge oversight. And it's interesting you say design, because the other part of it is that we talk about designing spacesuits, we talk about designing any of the architecture of these places where people are going to be in space. It also then means that we need to be looking for better equality when it comes to people who are actually building it and thinking about the design phases. You go to the engineers, you look at the space industry in general, representation is not good across all fronts. And improving that is not only important for the industry, for ethics, for morality, but it's also really important for the astronauts, because we need to have people who are thinking about these architectures from different perspectives in the very early design stages, so that down the road when an astronaut goes to put on the gloves, to put on the suit, they don't have to go back to the drawing board or make huge changes, but that those are thought of right from the get-go. So we have about 6 minutes left. So let's maybe take 1 or 2 questions before we do our wrap up, if anybody has any questions. Let's see, we have a question up here. I think there's a mic runner. Amazing. We had a question right up here in the front row first. Thank you. I'll open the front row first. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. It's such a pleasure to see you here and represent. I'm wondering, what would it take for more women to get involved, and is there any programs for women to be involved in for space?
Oh my goodness. There are lots of space associations you can join that also have women's groups in them. I should know if there's an actual women's space association. I don't. My guess is there is. There are so many new things that are being created these days, I can't even keep up. So find an association within your country, join, or even outside of your country, join and advocate. And I think the challenge is, the good news is the more women participate, the more voices are heard. The challenge is going to be, in spaceflight, it's hard to fix what is not perceived as broken. So the hardware that's been working for decades because your life depends on it, those are the challenges we're kind of having to push against, because making changes is life critical and is expensive. But like Emma said, when you get the chance, because there's a new program coming, Artemis or Mars, the moon or Mars, that's when you can insert your voices. So, for example, I'm association representative for many different groups, and we do have women's groups in there with an agenda, and we find ways to get into that. There are commercial, in the United States, there's also a commercial spaceflight federation, so you can get involved in the commercial spaceflight aspect of it too. I don't know, Faye?
Yes, I'd like to add, so that's a great question. So yeah, now as we're seeing that, it's important to address like women being in space. I've seen that like different space agencies or different universities around the world, they have women in science groups. Like I'm a part of the Women in Science and Women in Space group in New Zealand. I know that the UN has a Women for Space mentorship program. I've been a part of that, so that's definitely worth looking into. So yeah, I suppose you're just gonna have to do your research in terms of the area that you're in or the field that you're interested in. And if there isn't a group for it, then definitely start a group. And yeah, definitely look for mentors, or if there's a woman that inspires you or a group that inspires you, get in touch, talk to them, email them, reach out to them, and see how you can get involved.
Perfect, thank you so much.
I'll also add, if you're a student in Canada, the Zenith Pathways Fellowship is a fantastic program that is designed to help get any Canadian basically into space, but it's a great program to look at. And even if you're not a student, looking at their website is a great idea to find out who is in space and who's already volunteering to be a mentor, who would be really receptive to messages on LinkedIn and something like that. All right, let's take one more quick question.
Hi, I'm the founder of a STEM-based school here in Calgary. We have 1,000 students in high school. And one of the things that we do is connect our students to industry and post-secondary. And next year, we're going to be offering a course actually in space, which has had tremendous interest. So one of the questions we're going to get asked is, what degree do I need? What's my pathway if I want to end up working in the space industry? So I'm curious if there's any themes that emerge around that.
I get that all the time. The quickest answer is every possible thing. I have degrees in biology, mechanical engineering, and neuroscience, but I was a kid of the 80s, and so that was my journey. The future is Mars and Moon, and that is growing. And so if we're really truly about sending more people to those bodies, those places, more and more people are going to go, then you can imagine any kind of career that's on Earth that could be applied to that kind of location. One student once told me, she said, I want to be a moon Sherpa. And I was like, what is a moon Sherpa? She's like, well, I'm going to college for geology, and I'm learning about the moon sun system. I'm learning all about the moon, and I want to be the one to show the tourists around on the moon and point at what they're looking at. And I was like, okay, I never would have thought of that, but it's anything. It truly is.
Yeah, so I think anything that can be done on Earth, it can also be done in space. So that was something I kind of just like struggled with when I was trying to choose what to study, what to do. I had an insane passion for space, but I had no idea, did I really want to do astronomy and get into all of physics and that kind of stuff? Did I want to build rockets? But I had a true passion for medical science, human biology, helping people, advancing medical knowledge. I kind of wanted something that had this like real impact in people's lives. And so I chose that path, but I kept thinking about space. And that's when I got involved in space medicine, and then now landed my real first job in the space medicine world. So I think you can do anything. There's space law, space policies. That's still a really new field. Like, what does it mean to be in space? What are the laws around that? What are the ethics around that? What are the regulations around that? You could be a space artist, a space musician. You could be a space writer, a space communicator. So it's more than just being an engineer or being a physicist. Any industry can be involved in space. And I have friends all over the world in the space community who are space geologists or space lawyers, and they do all sorts of work. And I think that's great because you can kind of work in space, and you can also work on things that benefit the Earth.
Absolutely. We need everybody there. So we have less than a minute to quickly wrap up here. So I'm going to ask both of you, as we've talked through a lot in the last 45 minutes, we've talked about health in space, we talked about women's health in space, we talked about the shift from private to public, we've talked about new opportunities for research, why are we doing that research in the first place? For everybody walking away today, what would be your call to action or thing to remember from this conversation to take forward into the rest of Inventures and thinking about innovation beyond?
Sure. So I think my call for action would be that space truly is for all. It's for all people, it's for all groups, it's for all professions, all minorities, women, other genders. Like everybody can be involved in space, and it truly is for us. And I think another thing that I want to kind of point into about space is like as we go into space, it's this beautiful environment, it's this beautiful place. We need to protect it, we need to take care of it, we need to protect our Earth, take care of the Earth. As much as we want to explore, we want to venture, we want to benefit for ourselves, but we also want to take care of this beautiful environment that surrounds our planet and that our planet is in. And yeah, I think we just need to be supportive of each other. We need to support people who have passions into going into space, people who want to pivot into the space industry. And yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, our time is up, but I would just say pay attention to the headlines about space. It is all about you now, whether you know it or not, but it isn't just a headline. It is real, it is threatening. Space is a place that tries to kill you. And so it's not all good news and good vibes. It's very hard work, but find your place in it because it's going to involve you or someone you love or someone you know or someone that you're raising. So
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely day.